Good morning, everybody. I hope that this day is treating you well so far. Here's what we're going to do for geometry to start with today. What we are going to do is we're going to do a warm-up problem that goes back to what we did last week in class, dealing with solving quadratic functions. And so as you can see here, I have two quadratics, and the directions that I have say solve the following quadratics using any method. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is try and figure out what does x equal. And so last week in our green packet, at the end of the green packet, we talked about how to solve quadratics, either by using factoring or the quadratic formula. And so what I'm going to ask that you do right now is pause the video, go through and try and solve these quadratics. Try and see what does x equal. And so from that, then you can let the video play and you can check our work, and then we'll move on from there. So solve the following quadratics, pause the video, and we'll see what we wind up at. So if you don't know where to begin with, remember that our two options in order to solve are either by factoring or by use of the quadratic formula. And so in this first problem, what we need to do is we need to set it equal to 0 to begin with. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually subtract 24 from both sides of this. And so I won't solve it for you yet, but I just wanted to make sure that you recognize that, hey, we need to make this quadratic equal to 0. And so in order to do that, what we need to do is subtract 24 from both sides. And upon subtracting 24 from both sides, I now have it equal to 0. And now I can use my tools of either factoring or using the quadratic formula. So again, I'll pause it, and then I will go through and solve, and then you can check your work and see how well you have done. Let's take a look at how you did. On the first problem over here, you can take a look at my work. What I did was I factored, and so remember we used our boxed method. I always try and factor first to be able to see if I can do that. Multiplying a and c together makes negative 24x squared. I found my factors, and then remember, now at this point is where we set it equal to 0. Okay, so now I have x plus 6 and x minus 4 after I factored equal to 0, and this is where we use what we call the zero product property, where we set each of the individual factors equal to 0, and we solve for x. And when I did that, I got negative 6 and 4 for the value of x. Now, as I went on to the second problem, what you can see is that I tried to factor it here, but it actually did not work. There's no numbers that multiply to negative 8 and add to negative 3. And as such, I can't factor it. And so what I need to do is I need to use the quadratic formula. And so using the quadratic formula, then remember up here, it's important to identify the values of a, b, and c. We need to find those numbers that are the coefficients in front of my variables. And so in order to do that, then what I did is I plugged those values of a, b, and c into the quadratic formula. And so when I did that, make sure that you use parentheses around your work. So here, this is negative 3 squared. This value here is positive 3 because that's the opposite of b that we're taking. And one thing that I want to address and just want to highlight, inside the parentheses here, I have two negatives. So I have a negative and a negative. And when I multiply two negatives together, that's going to make a positive value down there. And so that value is going to be positive, which turns out to be the square root of 41. So underneath the square root, now I have square root of 41, which is 6.4. When you type that in your calculator. And then so from this point, remember we do a plus and a minus. That's where this plus or minus in the middle comes in. So I did the plus 6.4 on top, and I did the minus 6.4, and that yields two answers. I got 2.4 and negative 0.9. So there we got two different ways to be able to solve a quadratic. One through the use of the quadratic formula, and the other through the use of factoring. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to introduce ourselves a little bit to geometry, but I just wanted to practice our quadratic works first. So you're going to need a notebook. We're going to write a few basic ideas for geometry down, and then we will be all done for the day. And so as you can see here, this is section 1.1.1 from the textbook, and it talks about how can I design it, creating a quilt using symmetry. And what's going to happen today is we're actually not going to have you go to the textbook because you don't have access to it yet. Once I grant you access, then you'll be able to go and access that, and that will be taking place when we're in person together. But today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about symmetry. And symmetry is a very important idea within geometry. And so as you can see here, the heading says, Welcome to Geometry, but what is geometry? And at the end of this chapter, you'll have a better understanding of what that is. And geometry is actually used in every one of our daily lives. There's geometry all over the place. It's the study of shapes, and to see how they are applied within the mathematical and real world communities. And so what I'm going to ask that you do is just write down some ideas that I'm going to relate here in regards to symmetry, and then we will move on from there and give you access to your homework. So symmetry, what is symmetry? Well, this is the heading that I wrote down, and I would strongly recommend that you write down this definition as well. When a shape or an object can be moved to recreate the original shape, that's what we call symmetry. And we have various kinds of symmetry that we're going to discuss, but just generally speaking, if you can move a shape to be able to reproduce the original, that's what we call symmetry. When you can move it to get back to the original shape. But right now what we're going to do is we're going to study a specific kind of symmetry called reflective symmetry. And that's when a shape can be folded, specifically folding a shape, so that both sides of the fold will be matching perfectly with one another. And so I'm going to draw a couple of examples down here of shapes that have reflective symmetry. Since we just ended Valentine's Day, a heart would be an example if I could draw accurately, which is always a struggle for Mr. H. A heart would be an example of something that would have reflective symmetry. If I were to be able to fold along this red dotted line right here, that would in theory be our line that we would call our line of symmetry. And this line of symmetry is the point of where our fold would be to be able to match both sides of that heart on top of one another. And so imagine a heart that is drawn accurately. Hopefully yours might look a little bit better than mine. But if I were to fold my shape across that line, both sides would match on top of each other, hence having lines of symmetry. And so this heart has one line of symmetry. There are other shapes that you are familiar with. For example, if you were to draw a rectangle. And so if I were to take a rectangle, I actually could draw two lines of symmetry within this rectangle. And there could be one going horizontally and one going vertically. If I were to fold along either of those lines, I would get the exact same shape on either side. And so I would say that this shape has two lines of symmetry to it. And it is possible for a shape also to not have any lines of symmetry. So if I were to take something, I don't know, something that looks like this, like a triangle, like a right triangle perhaps, there's no line that I could draw to be able to fold this shape on top of itself. If one tried to draw a line going like this corner over here actually would fold over this side, and these two sides wouldn't match perfectly. And so we say that that has no lines of symmetry. And so it's possible for a shape to have one line of symmetry or two lines of symmetry or actually no symmetry at all. And so this idea of symmetry is just being able to fold something so that both sides land on top of each other. And that's actually the only thing that we're going to introduce today. And so this first introduction into geometry is just our ability to recognize symmetry and where it is landing, and to be able to have us practice that is going to take place on our homework. And so the homework is going to be found on Canvas through a concept check. And you can either look at the PDF for your homework. It's problems 3 through 7. Use the PDF to either do your work on paper, or you can do it on Notability. In addition, if you want to utilize some office hours today, you can go onto Canvas, click on my big name on the home page, and you'll see a link to the office hours down at the bottom of my bio page, if you will. Otherwise, feel free to give me an email. I hope you all are well, and we will see you soon.